All right. I've not got hit by any lightning bolts yet, so it's a good day, especially because I get to introduce a lineup of legendary speakers, starting with no other than the man that needs no introductions, Dr. Leshner. All yours. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Leshner.
That was a tour de force. I'm not sure I want to go next. All right, let me see if I can make this thing work. Boker tov, naim maod. See, that's it. That's all you get. All right, so we're going from some fair specificity up a couple of levels to beyond the forest, right? There's the trees, the leaves on the trees, the forest. I'm closer to the planet level. I've been asked to take a very broad look at where, in fact, trends in science are going. And not surprisingly, I'm not going to speak about anything related to life in extreme conditions, in keeping with the ancient principle, never discuss floods with Noah in the audience, and we've had a couple of wonderful days with people who actually know something about it, and I'm not risking it, lest I get struck by lightning in the same way. Well, what I'm going to do is focus more in the world in which I've been living for the last couple of decades, and that is what I call the broader context for science, both within the scientific enterprise and looking at science as a part of the rest of society. And as Charles Dickens would say, we're living in the best of times and the worst of times. I have to tell you an anecdote. I had the worst university education from a general perspective that you could have. I learned nothing about the humanities, nothing about the rest of the liberal arts, but I had a fabulous education in science. So when I first started using this saying, I used to say William Shakespeare, as William Shakespeare used to say. But at the time, I was the head of one of the institutes at NIH, and when you give out $1 billion a year, you're the smartest person in the room. Nobody corrects you, right? The minute I left NIH, somebody said, idiot, and you got it, okay. Now, on the one hand, we are living, in fact, in the best of scientific times. Advances in science are coming at a fantastic pace. Incremental advance, the way most of science advances, is accelerating. And then, of course, the appearance of new technologies, new ways to look at the world are enabling quantum jumps in understanding. They're enabling us to ask questions we never could even imagine before. My own background's in neuroscience. The ability to look into the brain of a living, breathing, awake individual changes the way we think about mind, the way we think about body. And of course, those technologies are giving us great practical significance, some of which you just heard. And in addition to that, for the first time in my scientific career, we actually are able to take some risks. Most of the American funding agencies have been traditionally extremely conservative. If you didn't have preliminary data and you didn't know pretty much where you were going, you couldn't get a grant. Now, for the first time, at agencies like the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, there actually is money set aside for what's called high-risk, high-payoff research. You're not allowed to say that in the United States, and therefore it's transformative or breakthrough research. But what we mean is high-risk, high-payoff research. All right. In addition to that, stepping further back, science and technology, as a part of modern life, have never been more important or more prominent in modern life. And in fact, if you think about it, science and technology are embedded in every major societal issue, whether it's a cause of the issue or a cure. I've been collecting issues. I won't read them to you. I put in living in extreme environments so that I said something about extreme environments. But this is just my own list of the major issues of modern life, and I would challenge you to come up with an issue, don't do it this minute, come up with an issue that in fact doesn't have a science and technology component to it. The corollaries of that is that in order for people to prosper in the modern world. They have to have a fundamental understanding and comfort with science and technology. And in fact, I would argue they actually don't need to know the details of science and technology. It crushes me that people don't have to understand the details of pituitary adrenocortical function, the thing I actually worked on as a scientist, but the secret truth is they don't. What they need to know is what is science, what isn't science, what's the nature of progress in science, how do you discriminate between real science and, as we say in the US, fake science. In addition to that, the fact that science and technology are so important means that for nations to prosper, they have to have scientific capacity, and I believe that's the argument behind the increased investment in science by all kinds of countries, rich and poor, throughout the world. My favorite example is Rwanda. Rwanda's the 7th poorest country in the world, and they have invested tremendously in science because they believe they'll build their future on their brains. So far, so good. It's the fastest growing economy in Africa. Again, in order for science to prosper, of course, the relationship between science and the rest of society has to be positive and it has to be strong. And the problem is that the science, do you like that? Look, I left NIH where I had 6 people who did nothing but my life. I went to AAAS and I had to make my own slides. Took me a long time to make that. I'd like more response. Is that fabulous or what? Thank you. Okay, there are a couple more like that. You'll like it. Anyway, but the truth is that at this point in history, science and society are experiencing a great amount of turbulence and a great amount of tension. And again, in my scientific lifetime, this is actually the toughest time for science that we've experienced with the rest of the world. So science, the public's view of science depends on a variety of things. Some of it is how good we are, how productive we are. Some of it is the public's understanding and engagement of science. And then some of it has to do with that third bullet, which is quite important, which is the public's view of how good we are and how trustworthy we are. And that has been called in question, again, for the first time in my scientific life. Some of the reasons for that are internal to science, and they're issues that require us as an enterprise to keep our own house in order. And again, I've made a list that I won't read for you, but each of them is actually a rare event. And we in the scientific community have a tendency to discount them. And we say not very important. But I can tell you that even relatively rare events have very broad and general effects on the way in which society views science, the enterprise. Reproducibility and replicability, the tough issue of the day, right, is actually not that common an event, even though there are papers that suggest large percentages are not replicable, but when you look at it, actually, it's not quite that true across all disciplines, but that's making people say, oh, well, maybe it's not true. Maybe if we wait for it to be replicated, it'll turn out not to be true, therefore we're not going to change the world. And so those issues are critically important. Many of them are violations of the ethics, norms, and values of our enterprise, and when that happens, trust is undermined tremendously. I just said that. And what I worry about is that it's not clear enough to the public. There's a big disconnect between science's view that says we're taking care of this, don't worry, trust us, and the public who says, trust you? Why would I trust you? You did those horrible things. And that disconnect undermines the ability of science to, in fact, do its job. There also are a bunch of issues, I'm sorry to be so negative early in the morning, but there are a bunch of issues at the intersection of science and the rest of society that are making the climate for science somewhat difficult. Every time I say that in any setting, people say, no, 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 but people love science. People still respect and adore science, and that as a generalization is actually true. This is actually a famous chart from the National Science Foundation, the National Science Board's annual science indicators. You can't read it, but I can, so I'll tell you whatever I want. But so this is a study that's reported every 2 years that shows what domains are most respected by the American public. Okay, you ready? The top is the military. Number 2 is the scientific community. Religious holy medicine is number 3, and then you get down to the press and Congress down here. And it's not a big shock that Congress is the lowest in the United States. And then this is just public confidence over the course of a billion years since 1973. And if you look at that blue line, oops, I'm sorry. I didn't mean, don't get your hopes up. I'm not done. There it is. Okay. If you look at that blue line, that's the military, and the red line is science, but you'll notice that the degree of public confidence is actually going down a little bit. That's the press. This is science. That purple line right there. Okay, so people love science. The problem, of course, is they have no idea what it is. When people ask, so what do you think about whatever, you think that's funny? 60% of the public believe in extrasensory perception. At one point in my career, I was the highest ranking psychologist in the United States government. And at that point, one of the senators, Senator Claiborne Pell, insisted that somebody be assigned as the contact with parapsychology, right? So I got to watch people like Uri Geller bend spoons and things like that and try to explain it. You can't believe who showed up at these events. Famous politicians who will remain nameless for the moment. 47% of Americans don't believe in evolution. 41% think astrology, that's not astronomy. Astrology is scientific. It's not, by the way. Okay. There are other factors, though, that are leading to it. One is misunderstanding. Some of it is that scientific progress is often politically or economically inconvenient. The problem with climate change is not that you can't convince people. They're dumb, but they may not be that stupid. You can see it happening. But what it is terribly, terribly inconvenient, both economically and politically. Or this last issue that to me is very important is when scientific advance conflicts with people's long-held beliefs or their deeply held religious values, science loses. It inevitably loses. This is just an example of the difference. This is a study by the Pew Research Group that shows the differences of what the public believes on the left and what scientists believe on the right. So genetically modified foods, you can see the 51-point gap. Using animals in research, right? Pesticides, humans have evolved over time. That's the depressing distinction. And vaccination, millions of children around the world have not been vaccinated because of a fraudulent one study that said that vaccines lead to autism. Think about the consequence of that. And then that issue of values is important, and I won't spend a lot of time on them, but the reason people object, for example, to embryonic stem cell research is not because they don't think it'll lead to new diagnostics and therapeutics. Rather, it's because of what you believe about when life begins. Okay, science actually has nothing to say about when life begins. It's not a scientific question, it's a belief question. If you believe it begins at the moment of conception, no embryonic stem cell research, you're taking a life. If you believe, as some religions do, that it begins later in gestation or at the moment of birth, not so bad, okay? Then I put in synthetic biology and neuroscience when I first started talking about those as conflict issues. People said I was wrong. Now we have people in religious groups objecting to mental materialism. That's what us neuroscientists engage in. We do mental materialism. That's you, Martin. You are a mental materialist. All right. Why do we care? So we care about these disconnects because they have consequences. Our job as scientists is not actually to be interesting and provocative, but to better humankind. And if the public isn't receptive, if the receptors aren't so great, our ability to do our job and have an impact is diminished greatly. We can't serve societal needs, public support is undermined, and in some countries, not to mention one that begins with US, actually the public and the government want to influence what science is done and what isn't done on the basis of those tensions that I just talked about. And those consequences are great. So what do you do about it? One thing scientists always do is whine. And so we go, oh, life is really hard. And so if you need to do that, take a moment, please, and engage. But on the other hand, many of us are arguing, and there is a big movement going on, heavily in Europe, and actually, ironically, in East Asia, but less so in the US until recently, around engaging with the public on these issues. And not just educating them poor, uneducated people who need us to explain it to them. Turns out explaining doesn't actually do that much. But rather what we need to do is engage and find common ground. And I won't spend a lot of time on that, but we do have data that show that engaging in the public is an effective approach, and it does improve the thing. This is just to brag for a minute. I just finished chairing a report for the National Academy of Sciences on how to communicate science effectively, and to my shock, so it's actually a fairly boring report. You can get it for free on the Academy website. But it turns out that in 2017, out of 300 reports, it was the second most downloaded report. Why? Because the scientific community has finally figured out that just talking to ourselves isn't enough, and we need actually to engage with the public, and it is an acquired skill. You're not born being able to do it. People think they're really good at it. Look how well we speak to each other. Okay, shut up, Alan. Okay, so all of that is about trends in the science-society relationship, and I'm going to spend my remaining time talking about trends in science, where I think science itself is going. You ready? And I'm going to go fast. So not shocking to you, the world of science has changed substantially over the last 50 to 100 years. If nothing else, the enterprise has grown greatly, and funding has gone up tremendously. More and more countries are investing in science, as I implied before, because they want to either solve local problems or build the economy or improve the quality of life of their people. This is the distribution of science funding around the world, and the message I'd like you to take from that is, wow, it's going on in a lot more places than you thought, and there's a lot more funding going on in places that never supported science until the last decade or so. This is a complicated graphic, but it's PPP. It equalizes spending potential of various currencies, but the only thing you have to see from this is that it has gone up tremendously in many different countries. Of course, the European Union has gone up. This is the US over time. I'm sorry, this is so blurry. It wasn't so blurry on my computer. This is the 60s, this is now, And the countries that have gone up really remarkably are countries, particularly in Asia. That one is China. And you can see that overall spending on research in China has now equaled the European Union and is approaching the United States very quickly. This is the number of researchers around the world. The message is, wow, it's going up very rapidly everywhere. This actually is interesting. It's the number of articles published by different countries, and you'll see, those of you from Europe and will admire that the European Union has been out-publishing the United States since at least 1995. The US is still the most cited country, but not by much, and look at the rate of growth in other parts of the world. This is just raw articles being produced. And then this is another measure of scientific articles that says the proportion. And again, the message here, if you look, is the US is going down, as the EU is also going down as a percentage, but is quite high, and it's starting to rise in other parts of the world. That's India. Okay, so that's one. So first of all, science is becoming more global, and as Subir Suresh, the new president of the Singapore National Technological University, has been known to say, good science anywhere is good for science everywhere, and I believe that, and that's an important trend. At the same time as that's going up, we have a whole array of pipeline problems that are not getting better. So we're training large numbers of PhDs. The job market is actually getting worse around the world, and as a very important problem, not unique, I believe, to the United States, but certainly dramatic, is that the young investigator pool is growing at a very rapid rate. I mean, they're aging at a very rapid rate. So the average age for a first grant from the National Institutes of Health is 42. That means that somebody has to wait until they're 42 before they can get their first grant, before they can start an independent research career. When I've used this statistic, the National Science Foundation always brags how much better it is there. It's 37. I was 25 when I got my first grant, because in those days you could go to college, go to graduate school, get a job, and get a grant. To be honest, if I had to wait till I was 42, I probably wouldn't do it. And that's happening more and more in the United States, and it's happening in other countries. People don't want to live as servants, slaves, until they're in their 40s and can start an independent career. Then, of course, we just had a wonderful example of it. Many of the most important scientific questions require cooperation among the sciences, but we're still structured in rather disciplinary ways. And that is another trend that will only get more dramatic over time, but is very difficult. Universities have departments. If you want to get tenure and get promoted in chemistry, you better publish in top chemistry journals. If you want to get promoted in biochemistry, you better do the same, biochemical journals, physical journals. But if you're doing the most interesting questions that we just talked about, most of them are multidisciplinary and require cooperation. Here's another one. Thank you. Okay, one more time. Good. I love doing that. The cutting edge is multidisciplinary. There's a new word now that we're hearing in science called convergence science, and it's sort of the epitome of multidisciplinary and moving together. Now, put together with that this trend is to move in multidisciplinary ways, but at the same time, the academic research systems, whether it's in government agencies or in universities, are organized in disciplinary ways. So there's just a tad of a disconnect that's going on there and that has to be faced. So I wrote an editorial in Science a number of years ago called The Demise of Disciplinary Science, and that's my theme, that disciplines are going to go away, but the lag between the demise of individual disciplines and academic change, which moves slightly slower than glaciers, is going to be a perennial problem long into the future. Okay, I'm not going to go through these in detail because I've been talking for a long time, but a number of years ago when I was at Science, we came up with what are the most important, she says, relax. I've been in the audience. So we posed the question to the scientific community, what are the most important questions? And what I liked about the answers in particular is, and again, there was a life science bias to it because of the nature of the methodology, but what was interesting is that all of them are multidisciplinary. All of them require cross-disciplinary activity in spite of the fact that we get trained in unidisciplinary ways, etc. So what that means is that even though we train people to be independent single investigators in order to succeed in answering critical questions, and again, the talk we just heard by Dr. Ferrari was absolutely the example of collaboration across disciplines. Collaboration is the norm and has to be the norm, but we're not training people in that way. And the new norm is actually international, global collaboration, and this is just another data point that I like, is the percent of research articles that involve international collaboration. And if you look over time, those lines are going up wherever you are, in Japan, in US, China, the United States even, and the EU, of course. So global collaboration is important, and that means that modern scientists need and will need to be global collaborating scientists. Now, scientists in Israel have always been global collaborating scientists because they got a lot of their advanced training in the US or in Europe, and that worked. But American scientists are incredibly ethnocentric, let alone Americocentric, and have not yet learned fully that global collaboration is far more productive than American. And of course, careers in science are changing. A famous statistic, again in the US, is 60% of new PhDs don't go into academic research, but we train them in the same way we always have to go into academic research. And if you don't go into academic research, your mentor stops talking to you. Actually, one more anecdote. So I started out as a basic neuroscientist, and I spent a decade in academia, and I was an okay, not a great scientist, but I got tenure and became a full professor. And then I decided to go into the government and try to change the world. And my mentor ripped his clothes, put ashes on his forehead, oh my God, you've wasted all of this training we've given you, because I gave it up. And it's interesting, 10 years later, he had my picture on his door, which I thought was sort of nice. But the truth is that stigma persists, and it hasn't gone away. And there's that disconnect that will only get worse in the future between what we train scientists to do and what they're going to turn into. That's just another data point from NIH proving my point. Okay. This is just to say that, in fact, there are lots of ways people can still be scientists and do other things. There are great careers elsewhere. We've heard some of it over the last couple of days. I wouldn't lie to you. There is life after academia. And it poses the question, looking again into the future, that says, don't we have to change the way we educate graduate students. If, in fact, we want to train graduate students to be healthy, happy, productive members of society who use science for the betterment of humankind, don't we have to adapt graduate education? That leads me to my other self-promotion, which is that right now the major study I'm chairing for the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine is on restructuring graduate education in science in the United States. And the attempt is to make it both still capable of producing great scientists, but great scientists who are far more flexible and far more able to work in diverse environments. We're almost done with the study. Keep watching. It'll be out in about April. Okay, so last slide. What's in the future? What we're going to get is more engagement between scientists, and the rest of society. We're all going to have to acquire the skills necessary to do that, or we're not going to make it as an enterprise. Science will be ever more global, and there will be less domination by countries like the United States. People always talk about the question of, is the United States still the best in the world? And the answer to that is no. The United States is really good, and it's the best in some fields, perhaps, but it is not universally true that it's the best throughout the world. More and more scientists are going to work in teams, domestically and internationally, and I predict disciplines will actually go away. What makes a scientific career will keep changing, and we will have to change along with it. Careers won't be linear, training will have to evolve, and the variety will expand. With that, that's the finding of the year. It's the merging of neutron stars. I love it. Okay, thank you. I've just killed the schedule totally. So, sorry.
Very good. Okay, thank you. So, no, don't go places. If you go places, she's going to fire me immediately. We take the opportunity to ask Dr. Leshner a couple of questions now, and then we're going to go into a break. Very good. So questions for Dr. Leshner, please.
Not so much a question, but a comment. I submit to you that we are entering a new dark age, and I could go into that, but let's put that aside. I think we as scientists need to clean up our house greatly. You've shown graphs that show that funding for science goes up, but I submit to you that most of that money is spent badly. Try to think how many NIH grants have led to Nobel Prizes. Not a whole bunch. Nobel Prizes started with work before there were NIH grants that NIH helped develop, but the nidus of the idea did not come from the grant. Look in the biological sciences. If you go to study sections that I go to, you see many grants that say, let's study Tai Chi to do this, or Tai Chi to do that. They've been going on for decades. Either Tai Chi doesn't work and we shouldn't study it, or it does work and we're not willing to apply it. In any case, studies like that should not be funded because they do not have a payoff. We as scientists seem to be unable to look at studies that are presented to us and say, this area of research is fruitful and should be fertilized, and this area is not fertile and should be killed. This is just a small part of the problem, but it's an important part, because money is going to get tighter and tighter. We need to put money after things that have a likelihood of doing betterment for mankind, not just allowing us to brag that we're spending more money.
I fundamentally agree with you, and I won't go through the detail of why it's too big a generalization, but in fact, study sections have historically been overly conservative preserving the status quo. It's the problem that scientists are unfortunately also people, and therefore they're not so hot on change. They don't particularly like change. And in fact, my two favorite Nobel laureates that I funded when I was in government, Paul Greengard and Eric Kandel, could not get grants for the work that they were doing. So to some degree, you're right. It also is the case, though, that agency leaders, some agency leaders, are in fact aware of the problem and are trying to structure things in different ways. But it's very difficult when dealing with human beings, called scientists, who in fact don't like change and don't like risk. Most people hate risk, and most people hate change. Therefore, it's very hard to do. But the scientific community is going to have to do what you suggest, or somebody's going to say, I'll do it. And in fact, we just experienced that in the United States when our members of Congress decided there were areas that the National Science Foundation was supporting that should no longer be supported, called behavioral and social sciences, which of course is a ridiculous assertion and a ridiculous belief. Okay, they can do that too.
Okay, so I got Dr. Sarma, you got 1, 2, 3 questions. Yes.
Okay,
So,
yell.
I agree that educating public is important and engaging the public is even more important. But there is another side of the coin, and that is governments, decision makers. They are increasingly making the decisions based on non-scientific assessments. And what can we do about that?
So scientists are, his point is extremely important. What do you do about policymakers or politicians who in fact are making decisions on non-science or anti-science? And the answer is, again, engagement. However, it's a learned skill. It's also the case that only scientists are stuck with what science shows, and scientists need to accept that. That is, the rest of the world won't get, as you just said, struck by lightning if they violate scientific truth, right? You can deny climate change. The world doesn't come to an end immediately. You don't get struck by lightning. If I deny it, I get struck by lightning because my job is to represent the scientific enterprise. But policymakers, they don't get hurt. So scientists have to learn how to do it, and then they have to go about doing it. Most scientists are slightly arrogant, if you haven't noticed, and they have thought that they're able to do it, and the truth is they're lousy at it and shouldn't be allowed out in public. But there you go.
Thank you. I really like this wonderful talk which you gave, and I think it's open up the whole can of worms, of course. And I
That's
think
the
that
idea.
one of the important things which I see from my perspective, which is a perspective of scientists who moved from one scientific culture to another, as you can judge from my thick Russian accent. I was growing up in Russia, and that's where I get all my scientific bearings. And then I moved to United States, where I learned new definition of scientist, which I was never aware of before. A new definition of scientist, which I learned when I came to United States, is the scientist is somebody who, due to lack of intellectual capability, was not able to pass to med school. So that was a hard lesson which I learned.
Say that
And
one again. I'm not sure I got that.
scientist is somebody who, due to lack of intellectual capability, failed to pass MCAT exam and go to medical school.
That's actually not totally true.
Yeah, we believe
It's a
yes,
slight
maybe
exaggeration.
Slightly, yes. But I think that part of the problem is that we as scientific community somehow allowed scientific profession slide into the second choice career for many people. That's what I see in my students who are coming. And of course I did exaggerate it, but we belong to a little bit older generation. And I solidarize with you, but when I'm talking to students who are 20, 23 years old, etc., for them, really science is a second-hand career, second-choice career. And that's what we need to change, really.
I think you spend too much time in the life sciences, because let me tell you, in the physical sciences, it's not true. It's absolutely not true. Some of the smartest people in the world are physical scientists and even life scientists. Okay, Ben.
This was a fabulously interesting talk, but there was so many contradictions in what you were saying, because on the one hand, science is improving and growing and money is increasing, and on the other hand, you're not getting a grant until you're 42 years old. I mean, this is a very significant difficulty for anybody who would fantasize
We call
about
that
being
greed, yes.
Yes. But I would like to hear you speak a little bit more about this disconnect, specifically in the United States, between the government and the quote-unquote leadership in the world who are scientifically morons, and the scientific community, which has to somehow bridge this gap. Do you have something specific that you have in mind about how that can be done? And against in an environment where lying is considered an acceptable tweet, right? I mean, what are you proposing that we do?
I'm going to avoid the politics part of that, but you can imagine where I stand on that. But I will say that the hope for science is in science asserting itself in polite ways. Scientists are not good at that last part. Again, a lot of it has to do with arrogance. But in my own experience, I spent much of a short period of my life trying to deal with the issue of teaching evolution in the schools, people trying to teach intelligent design. You can't influence the extremes, and some of the people you're referring to are the extremes. We have them too, by the way. We have evangelical atheists who, go out there and make enemies for us. But in fact, engaging with the public in a respectful, bidirectional way actually makes a difference. Now, in the individual cases, some of those people are not going to be influenced, but you have to influence the people who surround them, and 50 years of history of people doing that show that when we do that well, it actually makes a difference. Whining does not have an effect, and yelling at them does not have an effect. Those two things so far we've learned. So the only thing that seems to work is engagement, and that holds for whoever it is.
If I may ask you a question myself. You've spoken very eloquently about education and very eloquently about ethics, research ethics in particular. I have a concern that I don't know how to put the two of them together in the following sense. How do we teach research ethics? Of course, we are all agreed that there are many different perspectives and cultures and systems of values and whatever else, and we wouldn't dream of a universal ethics that pertains to pretty much any other walk of life than research. Yet we need to teach, of course, ethics, because without that the science that we do is not worth anything. So how do we approach that? With respect to a frame of reference, is there such a frame of reference? Is it a big Bible that some religion, a big book that some religion subscribes to? Is it some sort of lay ethics? Dogmatically, we cannot do that.
So
People come into the U.S. and we teach them, here is how we need to do that. That's
So we have
unsatisfactory too.
two converging issues. One issue is the incentive system. The incentive system in science, which is, publish in Science, Nature, or Cell, or die. You'll notice I said science first, not nature, like all his papers. But, yeah, we'll talk. No, let's not take time.
All of my papers are in Nature, because in science, every paper I ever submitted got turned down. My whole life and career. Truth.
We'll talk. I do therapy too. But the issue that Dr. Ferrari just raised is actually a tremendously important one, which has to do with teaching scientific ethics. a lot of the problems we have around ethics have to do with the incentive system that says publish in great journals or die. And if you don't do that, well, how are you going to do that? So it leads to violations of ethics. But we can teach it, and we have to insist that it get taught. And it has to be taught systematically, I believe, in graduate school. Good luck getting it done. Okay.
Alan, just one small one regarding your prophecy. How do you see the role of research institutes like this in the applied science scope?
You have to do both. People have overstate terribly the urgency of moving everything in a more applied direction. What we've learned from history is that most long-lasting advantages have a basis in ridiculous basic research, right? And fundamental research that many people say, why would you conceivably do that? And I can give you 30 examples if you misbehave. But you have to have a balance. That is, as society, I too want advantages during my lifetime. And therefore, there has to be a balance between investing in both. But you cannot afford to give up the basic research, or we won't get innovation. Innovation comes from unpredictable ideas.
Just wait, don't go. I just have
I don't
one,
want to get yelled at
No.
for keeping them.
I just have one comment, and therefore we open that. You said in the beginning that you are not talking on life in extreme condition. You are, and you did. And life, from my point of view, is the micro and macro environment, as I'm talking all the time. The mental, that you will help some other people, the culture, as well as the biology, and you talked about all of that. And extreme condition, you have very broad sense, and you talked about all.
Thank you.
I think, and therefore just look out, and we'll have now a very short break, but I think you need to strengthen your legs before the next three lectures. And I want to thank, I think these two couple did the morning, and Mauro will go on. So your last word.